All right. It is great to kick off with our first session for 2025. Last year was quite fantastic. We had seven, fantastic folks who came, shared their journeys and learnings about their careers and operations. And it is fantastic to have you, Arindam, to kick off our session for 2025. And we're starting with a heavy hitting topic, right, which is at the core of ops and everything related to operations, which is fundamentally how do you build high performance teams, how do you lead them, how do you retain people, and leverage them to drive their best and ultimately deliver what an organization needs to do. Thank you so much for finding time on this Sunday morning to spend an hour with us to discuss this.
No, thank you so much, Rohit and Shavato, for having me. It's my privilege and my honor to be kind of talking about it. I hope I do justice to the topic. But yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Awesome. So I think it'd be great to just kick this off with a quick icebreaker. We've obviously done our best to let people know who you are and why we are so excited to have you here on this session with us. But maybe it'd just be great to take a couple of minutes for a quick background on who you are, what your journey has been like, and then we'll jump right into it from there.
Sure, yeah. I always say like my journey has been about small towns and big cities. So I kind of grew up in a small city called Durgapur in Bengal, and then I thought for my college, at least I'll go to a bigger city. I landed in an even smaller town called Kharagpur. And then I thought, okay, after college, at least when I start my career, I'll land myself in a bigger city, hopefully. I landed in an even smaller town called Mandideep in near Bhopal, where I started my career with Procter& and Gamble. And coming from an industrial engineering background, obviously getting into an operations and a supply chain space was a natural fit for me. Did that for a year and then finally landed in a bigger city, Mumbai, after a year with P&G to start up. So this was back in 2008 when a lot of startups were actually kind of coming up in India, the Flipkarts of the world and the Mintras, etc. So Capillary and all. So they all started during that time. So that entrepreneurial bug bit me also, and I started up in 2008. But the day I landed in Mumbai, and I was staying up at my friend's place. The very next day, he actually returned back home quite early, and he was working at Lehman Brothers, and he said like I've been laid off, right? And this was 2008, so you know what period it was. And I thought like, okay, I've left a very cushy job at Procter and Gamble to start up. I don't know if this was the right choice in the middle of all of this that's happening around me. But lots of learnings. I think first time starting up, you always have a lot of learnings there. And we folded up after 1.5 years, after a lot of pivots, a lot of tries, etc., an acquisition offer which did not pan out, bunch of different things. But took all of those learnings and went to business school. Finally, a big international city, Boston, and a couple of wonderful years at business school. And there, I was fascinated by the learning experience that I had. No books, nothing, only reading cases and analyzing cases. And I thought, okay, this is a fascinating learning experience and a pedagogy. Why don't all universities have this kind of a pedagogy, right? And so from that point onwards, I started kind of always thinking about the education side of things. Obviously, I've been fortunate enough to have studied in really wonderful institutions where I thought, okay, why not kind of have this kind of pedagogy? But at that point in time, and I'm talking about 2010, 11, that point in time, whoever I would talk to about getting into the education space, everyone would say, why would you want to go into a not-for-profit sector, right? And I was like, okay. And obviously, with student loans on my shoulders, I thought, okay, like, why unnecessarily take that risk? Better to pay off my loans first, right? Otherwise, my parents would really not understand my logic at all. So far, they had not understood my logic, but I thought, let's not cause any more pain. So, interestingly, during business school, also, I kind of started up another thing which was called Trado Sports. It was in the fantasy gaming space. Okay. And at that point in time, the thought process, the reason why I started it up was to learn more about finance. and how capital markets work. And my professor said, "Why don't you build something? You come with that builder mindset. Why don't you build kind of a product of sorts, and I'll guide you on that." And he gave the idea of okay, fantasy gaming and all. So we built that out, which was around the 2011 World Cup. It was just before the World Cup, right? And by that time, IPL had already started off. So we had built out a fantasy gaming kind of a platform where player stocks, team stocks can be traded and all of that, right? In today's world, it looks kind of, yeah, it's kind of something which is already there. But uh, I think at that point in time, Dream 11 also started at that time. So not a lot of people know this, but at that point in time, fantasy gaming was just about starting off, and in India, it was kind of not a very big sector at all, right? And everyone I talked to in the gaming space is like, no, fantasy gaming is not yet popular in India, not a good choice. We got an offer to get funded as well, right? So, but and my professor at that point in time said that please go ahead and take that offer and like I don't know, like no against student loans, right? So, and I thought, okay, no, this is not sounding a very good decision. So I did not move forward at that point in time as well, and decided to get back into the corporate world. First in the healthcare sector, where I was fascinated by Clayton Christensen's work, and he was one of our professors at business school and the Innovator's Dilemma, and I thought I want to do something around that, right? And he was advising Avery Dennison, and so joined Avery Dennison, which is in the Fortune 500 companies list, and you're trying to build up a new business unit within a big Fortune 500 company, and it was a wonderful experience there. Worked with fantastic set of folks, perhaps one of the best teams that I've worked with till date, and learned a lot. But again, we were not able to build that business unit out because we realized that the sales cycle was turning out to be too long, right? And selling to healthcare, it's really tough, especially when you're selling technology products, very technology averse, right? And we were selling RFID kind of software, right? And it did not work out, so they decided to shut down the division. They said like, okay, you have two options on the table: either to relocate to Ohio, our headquarters, or you can take your severance and leave. Right. And I decided on the latter because I definitely did not want to land in the middle of nowhere, Ohio, and decided to stay back in Boston. And at that point in time, reached out to my mentor who happened to be heading product at TripAdvisor. And he said, like, we're hiring product managers. Do you want to kind of give it a shot? I said, like, I don't even know what product management is all about. And this is 2012. And at that point in time, I kind of thought, okay, like he's been a good mentor so far, so let's give it a shot. And yeah, I think that's where the journey into the consumer tech world started for me. And kind of decided to join TripAdvisor a couple of years out there. Then Flipkart somehow hunted me down. I still don't know till this day how they did it, but they found me. They rolled out an offer. I had amazing conversations with Sameer Nigam, Rahul Chari, and a bunch of folks who were there and who are now founders at PhonePe. And I thought, okay, this is an amazing team that I would love to work with. And e-commerce at that point in time was taking off in India. And I thought, like, okay, this can be a once in a lifetime opportunity where you are playing a role not just in terms of building out a company, but also in terms of building out an industry or playing a small role in building out an industry. And I thought, okay, let's take the plunge. Relocated to Bangalore in 2014 and joined Flipkart. Was there for almost 7 years, leading consumer experience and growth, going through a hyper growth journey of sorts at Flipkart, building products, building teams, being a small part of the entire growth journey, and lots of learnings. And then end of 2020, middle of COVID, decided that okay, my learning had kind of saturated a bit, and I thought, okay, let's challenge myself a bit more, and decided to take the plunge once again to a startup, and this time around once again back with the education space and with NextLeap, and we have been building it out for almost the last 4 years or so, and we've been scaling up gradually, slowly, steadily. And yeah, I think that's been my journey so far. Sorry if I took more than 2 minutes, but yeah, I think.
No, thank you so much. It was brilliant, to get that perspective on the kind of journeys you had, right? It almost seems in some ways things have come full circle, which is the education space.
Right.
and the
Yeah.
learning space that you wanted to be in some shape or form is where you have found yourself at this
Interestingly,
point.
my first startup was also in the education space.
I see.
So 2008, very different time altogether, and now very different space altogether, right? So, but both in the education space, yeah.
Got it. And it's fascinating that you've been in India, you worked in the US, you worked across different sectors, and obviously companies of very very different sizes, right? So Procter and
Yeah.
Gamble, and then in Boston, both like Fortune 500 companies, and
Yeah.
then Flipkart during the absolute hyper growth years, right, when e-commerce was getting built out in India into the
Yeah.
map that it is today, and then as an entrepreneur yourself, both previously and now. So maybe jumping in to one of the core aspects of this topic and getting a little bit into it is trying to understand across these things that you've seen and in general on your perspective, um, the whole idea about teams, right, and people in an organization. What do they sort of contribute to driving the business and the goals of the business
Yeah.
forward, right? I think, and this is a very very corny question, but it's something that I would like to start off with, something that sets the context a little bit, which
Yeah.
is when you talk about building great companies or working in a great company or a company being great fundamentally, right?
Yeah.
What does the team and the organization contribute towards building
Yeah.
vision? Maybe we set the context with this preliminary question, and then we go a little bit into the details of the
Yeah.
why and the how.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think what I have seen is like, as you said, like with Procter and Gamble, like it goes with a certain set of principles, purpose, values, principles, PVP, as it's called at P&G, and it starts off from the hiring process, the way they hire. It's all about an alignment to the purpose, values, and principles, and that basically makes sure that everyone within the team, right, they have a shared mindset of sorts, right? And that's very critical when you're scaling up a company there, right? On the other hand, I think if you look at uh, kind of say a Flipkart of sorts, right? And Flipkart is credited with having built one of the finest teams, I would still say, right, within the Indian ecosystem when they were doing it. And I always used to ask the leads, like, how come you guys were able to build this stellar a team, right? And that's why the Flipkart Mafia is it's called and all of that, right? And they had hired for that attitude, right, which was very different there, right? Which is that hunger was there to do something big, to hustle, to not be afraid of any mistakes and sort of challenge the status quo because they're trying to build out a category to begin with, right? And you needed that mindset. Quite different from what P&G was because it was a scaled up company. This was a growing company there, right? And when we were starting up NextLeap, also, that was the thought process. Like, okay, we want people who are trying to bring about a change, right? Who are not happy with the education system, and they can relate to that vision there. And that's basically how the hiring happened, right? So it's all about how you start building out the team because if you look at it, anything that an organization does, right, it's the output of the actions that the team or the members of the team actually take, right? So what are the actions that you want the team members to actually take? And that's where you are kind of looking for certain traits in those team members, and you're trying to kind of make sure that they are either aligning to that vision and there's a certain shared mindset so that the operating procedures are in place, or you are basically saying that, okay, I want people who can actually challenge the status quo because you are creating a new market of sorts. You need those kind of hustlers there. So I think you have to be very clear about what kind of a team that you want to build, and then make sure that you are bringing those members of the team together because the actions of the team is kind of the sum of its parts. So if you look at each of these team members that are there, you can never find kind of someone who is an exact replica of the other person. Each one will bring their own strengths, and then then the thing for you to focus on is how do I get the best out of this particular individual within the team, and make sure that person is able to realize his or her potential and in alignment with where the organization is headed, right? So, because if you're able to do that, then automatically everyone wins. The individual also wins, and the kind of organization also scales up. So that's basically the kind of spectrum that I've seen. Right, on one side you have the PNG, which is very standard, very straightforward kind of alignment with that mindset of sorts, and Flipkart again looking for people who are hustlers of sorts who would challenge the status quo, and then at NextLeap the folks who want to change the education system themselves, right, and trying to kind of come up with ideas on how to do that, right? Yeah.
Awesome. And one question that I'm curious about, right, as you look at the scale of these companies, right? PNG, huge, more than 100,000 people globally.
Yeah.
Flipkart, also fairly large. Even at the time when you were there, at least dozens, if not hundreds of people at that point of time. And from then
Yeah.
on after, and thousands today. And then NextLeap is an early stage startup with, say, a few dozen people working
Yeah.
in the org, right? Um, as you go from a small team to something, I mean, and we're going to look at this sort of in reverse, right? But as you look at, if you go from a small team where, say, you as the founder, as the CEO, have a very, very close personal connect with everyone that you're working with, right? You've, say, hand selected, the folks who you want to be in your team. And then you go to a
Yeah.
company like Flipkart where you have other individual leaders, functional leaders who are doing things. And then at PNG, you have management across like some 7, 8, 9 different levels, if I remember correctly, from
Yeah.
my time there, right?
Yeah.
As you move away from the center or the nucleus, which here, let's say, is like organizational leadership for the sake of argument, how do you sort of still ensure, right, that this aspects of culture, of alignment, these things, they don't just remain at the center, but they radiate outwards towards the entire organization, right? Um, do these dynamics in terms of how teams function, how leadership functions, is that something that you've noticed significantly changes? Or at the core of it, does it still remain essentially the same, irrespective of the size of organization?
I think it needs to evolve as the organization also scales up, right? Because if you think about it, as an organization scales up, their needs are also evolve, right? When you are in a startup, the first thing that you're looking for to get to product market fit, some kind of stability and things like that. Whereas if you're trying to go from that 1 to 10 phase, you're looking for very fast scale up of sorts, right? Some processes are in place and you're trying to put more processes in place. And then as you're going from the 10 to 100, you're looking to kind of scale up even further with a standard process in place. And you want people who can actually work with that process there, right? So the fundamental needs are going to be very, very different, right? So think about all the companies which are preparing for an IPO right now, and they would need people to abide by a certain process, right? And I always say, like, in your career, you should always choose companies which match the setup that you are going to thrive in, right? Not everyone can work in a big setup. Not everyone can work in a early stage setup, right? So it's a mutual fit that has to happen there, and only then the magic can actually kind of take place. And in from that context, also, if you look at it, um, the needs of the organization will continue to evolve. With the evolving needs, the organization structures will change. With those changing organization structures, the dynamics between the people, the relationships that you will have with people is going to change as well. And that also starts changing your span of influence and the span of control, as we call it, right? Um, so if you think about it, in a smaller organization where each person knows each other very well, knows exactly what is happening in his or her personal lives also, right? So that's the kind of a setup. Now, that is possible maybe in a team of 15, 20, but that becomes very difficult with a team of 100 or so. And then from 100, if you go to 1,000, it becomes nearly impossible to get there, right? And which is where organization structures play such an important role. And if you see organizations as they grow, they will change their organization structures. So we keep talking about the pyramid structure, the diamond structures, and all of those things, and the matrix structures, and all of that. And those are there for a certain reason, right? The reason being that, okay, this is the impact that I'm trying to create. These are the targets that I'm trying to hit. These are the milestones that we want to achieve. And in order to achieve that, what's the most optimal structure to have in place so that I can get to that target within this span of time, right? Um, and because of that, what happens is kind of the relationships or the interactions between those team members starts changing, right? So going back to, if you look at your chemistry lessons that we studied, right, the crystal structures and all of that, right? So it kind of resembles that. As you kind of keep evolving your organization, that crystal structure will also kind of evolve, and it has to evolve. Otherwise, you are trying to give different attributes to your organization now, right? From a startup which has to function in a very fast manner to one which has to function in an efficient manner to one which has to function in a very scalable manner, right? So these are different attributes that you're trying to kind of attach to that organization, and in order to attach those attributes, you have to change your structure. Just like for elements and compounds, etc., we talked about that, right? You're giving the additional malleability, additional this, and accordingly your crystalline structures will have to evolve. So it's a similar kind of a thing, which happens here as well. And that's the transition phase that organizations have to go through as they grow, right? Now, what happens as a result of it is, because you have people who have maybe started off with the organization, who have seen that growth. At some point, what happens is those people can no longer relate to the way the organization is functioning, right? And which is where you will see a lot of departures happening in organizations as they scale up, right? And it is a very natural thing. Now, in the media, what happens is we talk about it with a negative light, that, okay, these leaders leaving, this, that, all of those things. But it's a very natural kind of thing to happen for any organization, right? Because at different stages of the organization's growth, you need different skill sets, you need different mindsets to operate. And that's basically how I look at it.
Got it. Understood. And maybe jumping into the next sort of segment, right, Arindam, is trying to understand these teams, these structures, once you put them in place. And you start scaling a business, you start hiring people, you start building out that team. What is really necessary to allow people to thrive, right? As you said, for people to find that fit, for them to quote unquote be successful and then make the organization successful. One question that I have is, across these different teams that you worked in, that you've led, that you've built over time, what would you say from your perspective are the traits of what you would consider to be a high performing or a high performance team? Maybe we start with that base and then we talk a little bit more about what one can do, right? Because we have so many folks here in the community who are working in startups. There are some people who have founded their startups. There are folks who are in large companies leading large teams. And I think it's a question that comes quite often. Okay, how do I allow my team to be successful and thereby allow myself and my organization to be successful? So maybe we start with that first baseline question of
Yeah.
what is a high performing team, right? How do you know if a team is actually high performing? What are the traits? What are the attributes? What should one look for?
Yeah, I think the first thing is to define what high performing is all about. Like, and high performing can mean very different things for different organizations, for example, right? Now, PNG also is a high performing team, right, in a lot of ways, right? But you cannot compare a PNG with a young startup there, right? In which case, the high performance has a very different connotation altogether. So first is to define what do you mean by high performing, and that will have different meanings for different stages of a company. Um, and usually, high performing, typically, what I've seen in organizations is like some organizations will look at it from an innovation angle. Some will look at it from kind of hitting business targets. Some will look at it from kind of shipping out new stuff, right? And each of these will have different kind of repercussions on how the team kind of functions. So the first thing is to kind of define what you mean by a high performing team there. So I'll take the Flipkart example, right? So at Flipkart also, I would like to believe that it was a very high performing team, at least in the period that I was in. And at that point in time, I think Flipkart's focus was a lot more on the scale that it could achieve, right? So it was a lot more about how fast can we grow. And because we were creating a market, we were leading the way out there. It was all about how fast can you actually grow. And that's where uh, obviously meeting business numbers was an important thing, right? And everything revolved around that, right? Which was kind of what is the GMV that we are doing, and all of those pieces. How many customers are we acquiring? How many customers are coming back? And a clear set of metrics. And it was all about each team kind of having its numbers or targets also flowing from there, right? So as you kind of grow at a Flipkart scale, for example, all those top level kind of numbers then were percolated down to the individual teams, because you have so many different teams out there, each working in a certain way to help the organization achieve its targets, right? So then it becomes about an alignment of the company's kind of strategic direction and the strategic priorities with each of these teams kind of work, and making sure that each of these teams is able to help the company get to where it wants to get to. And that alignment becomes very, very important to make that kind of team a very high performing team overall. Now, there are multiple variables which play a role there, right? So there's the people variable to it. There is a rewards and recognition variable to it. There is a process variable to it, right? There are certain constraints also which are levied and things like that, right? Now, if you break it down even further, what you'll find is, in order for a team to do the things which will help that team achieve its targets, which in line will help the company to achieve its targets, you need the team members to act in a certain way, right? That what I mean by act is like they will need to do certain things, right? Ship out certain things, or kind of have certain things in place and things like that, right? So then the question comes into, okay, how do I get these individuals on a team to actually deliver what I'm expecting from them, right? And there comes the motivations of the people. Why would someone do it, right? If I'm expecting someone to actually deliver something, say for the big billion days, right? There's a certain thing which has to be released by this time and all of that, right? And they're working against time pressure, right? Now, you have applied a constraint that, okay, it has to be done by this time, right? You know, it is quite impossible to get to that particular point, but you need the team to be rallied around it. So the only way you can achieve it, right, is when you have really motivated and pumped up the team that this is what matters, right, to the organization as a whole, which means they need to see the bigger picture, right, understand the importance of their actions, and then they will work towards it. So there, that motivation part of it is very, very important, and that's the role that team leaders play in order to show that team that bigger picture and bring out the best in them, right? Which is why kind of you would see a lot of people talking about it. Also, those who have been part of the Flipkart ecosystem at some point or the other, saying that, okay, during Big Billion Days, everyone forgets everything else, just comes together, right? And at that scale, when you're having, say, 10, 15,000 employees coming together to meet one kind of common objective, that in my career, I have not seen, right? Like, it's just one thing which is bringing together thousands of people, right? Which requires each individual kind of team lead, etc., to care deeply about one, the business, and the second is how to motivate the team members to bring out the best and get that outcome in place despite the constraints that have been there, right? So which means you have to be very, very kind of focused on motivating the team there, right? Now, motivation obviously is a result of multiple things. You cannot just suddenly say and say, okay, we have to do this, let's do it, and all of that. It's a result of things which add up, right, over time, right? And which is why you have to kind of make sure that you are paying attention to the team's motivation, the team members' motivations over a longer period of time, and which is on the day-to-day basis, right? So that's how kind of I look at it, by breaking it down step by step there. And yeah, I think once you're able to do that, then it becomes kind of easier, right? But going back to that fog model, which is quite famous, right? Behavior is a function of the motivations, the abilities, and the triggers, right? So you are trying to get your team members to behave in a certain way, which means you have to understand the motivation of that individual. That individual needs to have that ability, which is the skills part of it, and then you have to have some triggers which will bring out the best in them, right? And that's the easiest way in which I can visualize how to kind of drive the motivation there. Yeah.
And Arindam, this entire aspect, right? Like you've spoken here about people being motivated, which also naturally then leans towards people taking ownership towards doing things. And previously, when we were talking about the kind of organizations that you'd been a part of, you also spoke about where there were people who wanted to challenge status quo, and then now at NextLeap, people who want to fundamentally change how these things are done, right? Now,
Yep.
my thought process is when you have people who want to move fast and break things, when you want them to challenge status quo, that can also often mean challenging the organization, its thought process, right? Even challenging certain ideas that leadership might have,
Yep.
right? And that's how the
Yep.
organization grows and evolves.
Yep.
How do you create an environment where people feel, safe and comfortable enough to challenge ideas, to admit mistakes, and then to actually take ownership and drive things? I think that's another question
Yep.
that I have, right? Like we've got the setup for what a high performance team looks like. It's all of these things coming together is
Yep.
my takeaway. Um,
Yep.
let's talk a little bit about how you can sort of enable this and allow it
Yeah.
to happen.
So at least the way I look at it, each individual action that you take as a team lead, right, as a founder, etc., counts towards it, right? It is not about one kind of annual email that you send or something like that, which will bring about that particular change, right? It is about everything that you are doing on a day-to-day basis because everyone else is looking at that, right? And is taking a signal from that, right? Any action of any of the leaders is kind of a signal to the rest of the team that this is what matters, this is what counts, this is what gets rewarded, and things like that, right? So if you think about it, if you are in a meeting and if you are allowing everyone to speak, all right, then everyone gets an idea that okay, my voice counts, versus if in a meeting you are the only one who is speaking, and you are not listening to what others are saying, then the signal that people will get is that okay, my voice does not count, right? Similarly, if you are inviting ideas about a problem versus you are just saying this is how it should be done, then again, kind of the signal that people are getting is very different, right? So it's all about signals and the receptors, right? So the emitters and the receptors there, right? So you are emitting signals as the team leaders, right? And you have the team members receiving those signals, right? And it's all about understanding what signals do I need to send at each different situation, right? For example, if you are sending out a signal which basically makes people afraid, right, to act in a certain way, then they will not act in that way, right? Now, is that the right signal to send to change behavior? That depends on the context, but you have to pay attention to those signals that you're trying to change, right? So, example again in PNG, I think since it's a manufacturing setup, there's a lot of focus on safety, for example, right? And as humans, sometimes we don't care so much about the safety side of things, okay? And it is imperative for the leaders then to drive the notion of safety among its kind of employees there, right? And how do you actually drive that is the question, right? And if you are able to understand why people are behaving in a certain way, then you can actually make those interventions, put in those interventions there, right? But at the core of it, the way I look at it is it's all about the signals that you send on a day-to-day basis, right? It's not a one-time thing. It has to happen on a continuous basis. which is where you will need to look inward about, okay, what is the signal that I want to send? And be very, very clear about that. And then kind of you will see that change happening kind of gradually, right? It's not going to happen kind of immediately many times. And that's why communication is kind of is such a strong pillar there, right? Once you keep talking about something again and again and again and again and again, right? You will find that people will start paying attention to it, right? And when I started my career at Procter and Gamble, this is one thing which I learned from my manager, right? And he said that, okay, you have your daily stand up. What you talk about in the daily stand up matters the most, right? What all are the metrics that you are focusing on? If you talk about safety every single day, right, and you are looking at that metric every single day, in a couple of weeks you will start seeing that change because people know that this is what matters to you, right? But if you talk about it once a week, then people will be like, okay, if he doesn't care about it, then I don't know if I should care about it, right? So that's the thing. Even at Flipkart, that is one thing which I had instituted. Every Tuesday was the review day, right? So Tuesdays I would be found in one conference room for the entire day. All my teams will come one by one, and we had a core team set up there, and they will have to talk about the metrics for the last week, right? The metrics would have been established beforehand, and they would have to explain why a certain metric went up or went down, right? So they knew that this is what matters, that before coming in to that meeting, I need to know exactly what's happening in my product, right? Because if I don't know, I'll be grilled, right? And everyone used to gradually start coming prepared. And that my thought process was that I need to drive the data orientation amongst my team, right? Everyone should know their numbers really well, right? So that if I ask them in the hallway, they know exactly what the product is doing, right? And even till this day, a lot of my team members who have now gone on to kind of become product leaders, etc., in different other organizations, they still message me saying that, and then we have instituted this in our new organization and it works like a charm. All right. But the core of it, it's all about the signal that you're sending, right? Because I can ask you to become data oriented, but it's not going to work out. But if I just put that process in place and I keep repeating the same thing again and again like a broken record, then people will understand this is what matters and we need to pay attention.
Got it. No, I remember this very, very distinctly that when I started working at the factory at P&G right out of college, a
Yeah.
plant manager used to say that an operations manager's core job is to be the chief reminding officer
Yeah.
of their organization.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if you repeat it enough number of times, if
Yep.
you focus on it for long enough, eventually, as an outcome, you will be able to drive
Yep.
what you're looking for. Yeah.
Yep.
I think this is definitely going to be one of those pieces of advice I'm also going to pick up and add to my things of to dos in my organization. Um, so I think, having said all of this, one thing that, like you mentioned, that since while the organization grows, the team dynamics change, right? When you are at a small scale startup stage, you focus more on agility, you focus more on growth, you focus more on shipping things out, making changes that make you more competitive or make you
Yeah.
gain more market share as soon as possible, right? At that point, you're not really worrying about processes, putting things in place. But when you're a large company, say you have IPO'd or even larger, right? One thing that changes is that from your like as a leader, your objectives also change, right? From focusing solely on growth, focusing solely on being agile, you start focusing on meeting targets because you're now public, you're now a big entity, you now have to meet numbers. So governance takes a front seat. It kind of becomes something important over everything else. So given all of this, like how do you kind of drive this change within your team, right? Because you have been saying that be agile, uh, come back fast with whatever the task that I give you. The I
Yep.
need you to get this done by tomorrow. Then you suddenly have a shift and start saying no, do it the right way. So that, as Warren Buffett has a quote, right, that invest in businesses that can run by fools also, because one day a fool eventually will run that business, right? So you have to come up with setting up processes, good enough processes to run that. So how do you kind of bring this dynamic shift in the entire culture of the organization and build it into your team?
Yeah. So if you look at it, and this is one thing which I have started noticing as well, right? That the older way of building out companies is now changing or is being challenged with a newer way of building companies now, right? So the older way is where what you just said mattered a lot, right? Which is growing at breakneck speed, right? Not caring about processes, etc. Get to a certain scale, and only then I'll care about governance and things like that, right? And now I think that has changed, or is kind of fast changing, where governance is something which should be part and parcel of your even growing up stages, because otherwise it becomes very hard to actually almost steer a Titanic in a different direction, right? But if you lay out those foundational pieces, right, of building out organizations right from the beginning, it becomes an easier switch going forward, right? So that's one thing. But how do you do it? I think, again, the thing is, there are several tactics which I've seen, right, at a scale there, right? So one is, you need to understand who is going to take the actions that you are trying to put in place in terms of the process steps. It's going to be your team leaders and then your team members, right? So what you're trying to do is to bring about a change in behavior in those individuals first, right? Or a change in mindset out there, right? And which is why what I told you earlier is that as a company grows, it realizes also that the people who actually help me to grow till the state are perhaps not the right people to help me to grow to the next stage, right? And it's quite natural. It happens with all organizations, right? It's a growing pain of sorts, right? But it has to happen there, because what you hired for maybe 6 7 years ago, now what you need is very different, right? So that individual may not have that kind of skill set or that mindset to operate that way, right? So first is to look at, okay, do I have the right people in the right places? Okay. And once you realize that, okay, I have the right people in the right places, then it's all about the process, because at the end of the day, you just cannot put in the process and expect everyone to follow it. You need to also have the people with the right mindset there to begin with, right? Once you have the right people, then it makes sense to kind of put in the process in place, and then kind of getting them to abide by those processes there, right? So I think it goes back to the people again and again, right? Who you have, what kind of mindset, what kind of attitudes you want from that particular set. Which is why if you see in a startup, you would usually try to have a lot more generalists, right? Because you want everyone to do a bunch of different things, right? Because you are still trying to find out what works, what does not work. But in a scaled up kind of a company, you would usually look for specialists, right? And you want people to have that specialist kind of mindset. Okay, they know exactly what needs to be done in a scaled up manner. They know how to navigate through bureaucracy, through the different layers of the organization, right? That's a very different skill set, right? Now, as much as we would want someone to be able to thrive during kind of a startup phase as well as in a growth phase, it does not work out, right? So which is why it's very, very important to make sure you are having the right people also in the place. Many times you will find also that founders will leave their CEO role also, right? Because they realize that what the skill set that I need, right, to run this company is a skill set that I do not have. I need someone who has that operating mindset a lot better with the process and things like that, right? Which is why a lot of founders, you'll find them going to a chairman role and then recruiting a CEO for that role, who would actually do a much better job, because the company's stage is such that it needs a very different skill set, right? So these are kind of natural progressions of organizations, which we need to kind of understand about, and based on that, kind of the DNA of the organization also sometimes changes, right? Because the way a founder would have built it out in an early stage, with different complexities, different kind of challenges, etc., versus the way another person would build out from in a scaled up manner with a very different set of challenges and different sets of constraints, etc. You need that different mindset there, right? So that's an important thing to note there. Yeah.
Awesome. So here, since we're on the topic of finding the right fit for the given circumstances we're in, and as you said that when organizations change, some people we might even have to let some people go because they were more relevant for the previous part, and now their
Yep.
skill set might not be the best. Right, we are shifting
Yep.
from generalists to specialists.
Yep.
As a leader, I understand that you have been comfortable, say you have been working with this team for 3-4 years, building this entire piece out.
Yep.
Now you realize your team is not relevant anymore and you have to start from scratch, right? That would give any leader jitters, right? To have to start building their entire team from scratch. So I would want to ask you the question that when it comes to hiring, right? Hiring for the right fit for the people you want in your team, how do you approach this, right? What are
Yep.
you looking for when you hire for your team, right? And what
Yep.
are like some of the methods that you use to understand, or some of the parameters that you specifically look for when you're hiring for your team?
Yep. Yeah, so again, the approach changes depending on the stage of the organization, stage of growth of the organization. But I'll tell you one fundamental way in which I think about it is you always have to be in a hiring mode, right? You cannot be in a hiring mode suddenly, right? That's not a good state to be in, right? You always have to be in a hiring mode, which means you are always trying to find out good talent. Okay. And which basically means you are continuously networking, you're continuously reaching out to different people, etc. And you have people on your mind, right? That okay, these are people who might be a fit in the future. Okay. Um, and the way you actually start thinking about the hiring side of things, or at least I think about it that way, is trying to figure out, okay, what is the state that I want to be at 1 year down the line, or at least 6 months down the line, right? And what would be the additional complexities that I would have to deal with? What is the additional kind of set of challenges that I would actually have on my plate? And accordingly, how do I start kind of looking for those kind of individuals from now on, right? So that you have a head start, right? Because again, hiring is what happens otherwise is that if you suddenly start hiring, right, then you might compromise on the talent quality, because then your focus is okay, I need to kind of fill this position as soon as possible, and you are not actually focusing on what you need, you are just trying to fill that position. Versus if you already are kind of in a hiring mode, right, you are already looking out for different kind of talent, right, then what happens is whenever that opportunity comes, you know that there are a set of people who I will immediately reach out to, right, and get those people in. Okay. um, at Flipkart, when I was building it out, I think when I started, I had two product managers reporting into me. By the time I kind of ended my stint, there were, I think, about 30 product managers, close to 200 plus engineers, close to about 30 plus designers, and 10 user researchers. All of them were rolling up to me. And a lot of these teams had to be built right over time. Now, it is not that suddenly the requirement comes in and then you start kind of hiring, but you are actually anticipating what is going to hit you, right? And that's what leaders will need to think about, that okay, this is my long term strategy. In the next 1 year, this is where I want to reach, right? This is where the company wants to reach. These would be the additional things which I would need to think about. So you start planning that beforehand, right? That okay, these are the kind of people I would need. And based on that, you are kind of already in a hiring mode and reaching out, making those connections and things like that. And then kind of trying to figure out who is the right fit at what point in time, right? So that it's not like a sudden kind of spike in hiring, right? The focus should always be on the quality. And when I talk about quality, it is not just about the skills, but also about the mindset or the attitude, right? Because as your company grows, as your product grows, you would need a slightly different set of skills, a different set of attitude, a different mindset, right? Uh, and also at different levels, right? So when you are actually leading teams, you also need to figure out at what level do I need the talent? Is it at an L1 level? Is it an L2 level, L3 level, and things like that, right? So which means you are painting the picture of the organization in a future state. So you are living in the future, right? So, and that's the hard part, right? Because you do not have a crystal ball to gaze into, figure out what the organization structure might be. But people who do that really well, I think they're able to also attract talent quite well, because the way they would attract talent is by actually telling them, hey, this is the future state that I'm trying to build. Would you like to be a part of this? Versus saying, hey, this is an L1 level role. Are you interested? Right. So it attracts a different kind of people as well. Right. Even at Flipkart, when I had joined, the reason why I liked the team was because they painted a story of e-commerce in India. Like I was like blown away. I was like, that is a brilliant kind of an ambition or a mission, right? And I would definitely want to be a part of that, right? So that's basically how I look at least when building out teams.
And Arindam, pulling on this thread a little bit more, right? And looking at some of the other things that you said in the conversation. For example, product management, which today is almost ubiquitous. I mean, everyone. I mean, there's a joke that if you throw a paper ball in Bangalore, it'll probably hit up a software engineer, a startup founder, or a product manager in some shape or form. When you were joining Flipkart as a product manager, it wasn't really a career path or a functional role that was at the forefront of everybody's minds, right? At the
Yeah,
same time, just going by what you said, it was very clear. I mean, it's clear in hindsight that Flipkart as a company would need a lot of product managers over time to become the company that it has today,
yeah,
right? I
yeah,
remember when I was in undergrad, the associate product manager program
yeah,
at Flipkart was all the rage, right? Like it was one of the
yeah.
most sought after roles that people
It
were
still
trying
is,
to
I
get.
believe, but
And
yeah.
it still is, right? It
Yeah,
still is one of the most sought after roles that people wanted to still do, want
yeah,
to get into after their undergrad, right? So my
yeah,
question really here is, um, how do you design some of these things, right? It's not just about forecasting the role, but here there's also a significant amount of work that's gone in to
yeah,
make the people future ready, right?
yeah,
And it also in some shape or form served as a competitive wedge for Flipkart to be able to
yeah,
get top talent. Could you tell us a little bit
yeah,
about this about the program, but also in
yeah,
general, right? How do you think about, like, once you forecasted it, you have an idea of what the future state of the organization looks like, you have the people in mind, but a little bit also about how you know figure out the skills and the enablement aspect,
yeah,
especially when things are a bit fluid like they are in high growth
yeah,
startups.
yeah. Yeah, so when I joined Flipkart in 2014, I was told to lead the campus hiring part of it. Okay. And the first year I went there and I was like, I'm hiring, that's okay, right? From the campus, I'm okay to drive the operations, but what are we trying to achieve out here, right? That bigger goal was missing, is what I found, right? And as I spent a few more months at Flipkart, what I realized is that hiring product managers in India was really tough, because you did not have anyone with that product management experience, right? Very, very few companies had product managers to begin with. So I remember what Niket and I had pitched to the leadership at that point in time. Niket was the chief of staff to Puneet, who was the CPO, who had joined from Google. And both of us resonated on this problem statement, and we said, like, hey, like, it's not just about Flipkart, right? Flipkart we are looking at it as the pioneers in the technology space in India, right? Now, if we believe Flipkart wants to have a role to play in helping build this technology ecosystem in India, then what are we doing to actually build that talent pipeline, right? So it was not just about hiring for Flipkart. It was about how do we actually build out a talent pool of sorts which can help drive this technology ecosystem, right? And that was the kind of at the core of it. And when we said like, okay, like to do this, what do we need? Uh, the answer that was coming up again and again was not that we need people with experience in product management. We broke it down to figure out, okay, what makes a good product manager, right? And repeatedly, what was coming out was the rebellious mindset, the challenging status quo, the data orientedness, the customer empathy, and things like that, right? And then the question that we asked ourselves is that why do we need to only go to business schools to hire then, right? Is there a reason why we are hiring product managers only from business school? And answer to, we could not defend that question at all, right? Defend that answer that go to business schools only to hire. So, which is where the thought process was like, what if we hire for the attitude and train for the skills? Okay. Because the skills that are required, the hard skills that are required, can easily be trained, right? But for that, we need some really smart individuals, right? And that was the thesis around which the Associate Product Manager program or the APM program at Flipkart started in 2014. And in the very first go, when we started, we had three of them join us, right? One of them right now is at Google, Sydney. One of them is heading AI products at booking.com. And the other one is at Stripe, right? So all of them have gone on to actually do bigger things in life there, right? And since then, what appealed to that campus there, right, to the campus students was obviously the fact that they would get to join Flipkart. And the way we positioned the role, what we realized is the awareness about product management also was another big problem, right? And which is where we said like, okay, we need to bring awareness in about the role to begin with, right? And we started doing workshops at each of these campuses, and we started off with the ITs and the bits, right? And that kind of really brought in that awareness, and people said, I want to do this role, right? And compensation, etc., was very attractive. And then the next step of the process was, okay, now the awareness is there, but now how do we get the best of talent, right? And the best of talent, the way the process works, and I'm not a big fan of the process, but it's a reality in most of these ITs and bits campuses. You have a day zero and day one and all of that. And typically you will find consulting companies come on day zero, right? And a lot of the talent, right, that you would want to get onboarded would go to consulting companies, right? And coming from that institution, I knew that this is how it's going to work. So we laid it out to the campuses very clearly upfront that we come to your campus only if we get a day zero slot, otherwise we don't. Right. So now what had happened is because we had created such an awareness, right? There was a pull from the students that we want this company on day zero, right? So the placement committees were under pressure, right? And we said like we are not going to meddle into this mess, right? You figure it out, but our stand is very clear. We come to your campus only if we get a day zero, otherwise you don't, right? So that's how we started our inroads into kind of each of these different campuses. And then the next part is we always say there's the first moment of truth and the second moment of truth. The second moment of truth is when these people then started talking to their juniors like, hey, this is a fantastic role, right? So then the next group actually started getting prepped, and then these people started taking up the responsibility of spreading the awareness. So the beauty of the APM program is, and very few people know this, is it's almost run by APMs themselves. right? So I was obviously leading it, right, for the time that I was there till 2020, and but there is a bond that is there, right, between the APMs. They help each other out, right? They would mentor their juniors. They would actually take up the responsibility of hiring and things like that. And because these skills are also inculcated so early in their career, they started getting kind of really good responsibilities there, right? Because their maturity levels were kind of a lot higher, right? Because I always used to have this statement in the first session with them was that I'm going to throw you at the deep end of the ocean. I know you cannot swim, but I know you have the talent to actually learn how to swim, right? So now I want you to show me that you can swim, right? So prove me right out here. And because these were a very smart set of people, imagine 2,000 plus applications and we would select 10 people. It is like, I sometimes joke, even if I were applying right now, I wouldn't be able to get through, right? So it's really, really selective. But being selective also sometimes helps spread the word, right? Because then it's a certain eliteness that gets associated with that. And that helped us to kind of draw the next set of people as well. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much for this. This is, one of the questions that the moment we knew that we were going to have you as a speaker, this is one question that I really, really wanted to ask, because obviously when I was at KGP, we'd heard about you, we'd heard about the APM program,
Yeah.
and nobody was really doing anything like it
Yeah.
in terms of campus hiring. I'm sure all of this, I mean, I've been out of college now for at least 6 years, but I'm sure all of this has become
Yeah.
a lot more common today than it was in 2016, 2017, even
Yeah.
2019 when I was graduating and my batch was sitting.
There have
For
been so many companies who have reached out to me saying, "Ki help us build the APM program." And I'll be happy to tell you how we built it. But unfortunately, I think I have not seen any other company be able to replicate that, right? And the reason for that is because I feel they missed the trick of getting the APMs to bond and make that a community in themselves, right? Even right now, if I actually message an APM saying, "Hey, let's gather all the APMs together for a dinner or something," I'm pretty sure within a week's time you'll be able to get that group
No,
together
that
again,
makes sense.
right?
It
So
makes sense. It's like a badge of honor in some
yeah,
shape or form, like you said, right? It's being a
yeah,
part of quote unquote an elite community, special forces in the within
yeah,
the regular army, something of
yeah,
that sort. And I think when you can drive that kind of pride
yeah,
in the role, I mean, it goes wonder. It does wonders in terms
yeah,
of not just being able to hire people, but on a continued basis, the NPS of the company of the role, and it
yeah.
becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, as you just said it. We have a question from somebody in the audience. Bhavya, you've put your question on chat. Would you like to maybe turn on your camera and just ask Arindam directly? Might be great. And if anybody else, we're also reaching sort of the end of the session. We will be wrapping up soon. So if you all have questions on anything that Arindam has mentioned, or there are things that you are looking at in your leadership and team responsibilities that you would like to discuss, now would be a great time to throw those questions out there.
Hi, Rohit. Sure, I'll do that. Hi, Arindam.
Hi, Bhavya. Yeah,
My question was that we can control the signals part of things, but how do we manage the reception? So, for example, individuals in your teams are whole human beings and they have their own journeys and mindsets.
yeah,
And all of this can alter how they perceive your signals. Some might
yep,
perceive it the way you intended,
yep,
others might not. So, how do you make sure that all the people perceive the signals that you're sending in the way you intended that
yep,
surpasses their subjective understanding?
yep. Yeah, good question. So I think it comes back to first understanding the individual a lot more deeply and what their motivations are, what they are looking to achieve, what they are thinking about in terms of their role, how to kind of deliver impact in that role. So it comes down to understanding that individual a lot more deeply to begin with, right? Because if you understand the way that individual thinks, understand the way the individual acts and why they do it, right, then you know how, or at least you will know how the signal might be anticipated or might be received by that individual, right? But if you're not spending effort to understand that individual at a deeper level, then you are just kind of creating a monologue of sorts, right? So again, keep in mind, it's always going to be a two-way street, right? For the signal to be received, you also need to have a listening mindset, so that at other points in time you are also listening to the signals that they are sending, right? So it cannot be that the other person is sending signals which you are turning a deaf ear to, right? And you are expecting your signals to be received by that particular person. So that wouldn't happen. So it's always a two-way street, and you need to make sure you're establishing that two-way street upfront, right? So that you know that, okay, the individual now knows that whatever he or she has to say is also being received, and then you will see that reception from the other individual as well.
Understood. So what I take from this is that they are also sending you signals. So you have to receive it in a way
Absolutely.
and then
Absolutely.
alter your approach individualistically to each individual. Is that correct?
Yeah. So again, the thing is, when you are sending a signal, right? As you rightly said, different people might interpret it in a different way, right? Which is where sometimes it's a good practice to follow up with different individuals, and that is where your one-on-ones, etc., come in handy, right? Wherein you are trying to make sure that the understanding is clear, and if there are any follow-up questions and stuff like that, those get kind of cleared out, right? So that you are getting a high confidence that it's been interpreted in the right way as well.
Understood. Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure.
And Arindam, one question from my side, maybe going on the thread, right, of looking at the interaction between leadership and individuals, right? One of the things that often becomes very hard, and it can go wrong also from both directions, is the whole quote unquote aspect of performance management, of the feedback cycle, of all of these things, right?
Yeah.
There's oftentimes no easy way to tell people that, they maybe haven't done something right or they need to improve, but it's super important to still do it because that's an important part of growth. And then also to do it with respect and empathy, such that it energizes the person to do better rather than demoralizing
Yeah.
them or making them
Yeah.
feel that they're not respected or whatever, right? And we see
Yeah.
this happening all the time in all sorts of organizations of different scales, different tenures, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
So I want to understand, what was your approach, right? Like, you were managing such large teams of people, you were managing leaders who
Yeah.
were managing other people. How do you quote unquote approach, this whole aspect of performance management, of feedback, and ensure that it drives the company forward and the individual forward and makes them a better, helps them become a better version of themselves?
Yeah, see, to be very honest, I'm not a very big fan of the performance management system as it exists in most organizations. I'll be very honest out here, right? And which is why at NextLeap we have taken a very different stance, stab at it, and I'll talk about that in a bit. But uh, the reason why I'm not a very big fan of this is because you're basically saying that I am trying to manage performance, all right, which goes under the assumption that you're assuming that that person's performance has to be managed, right? Which I'm not quite sure of, because if you've hired someone, you have hired someone because you feel that person can perform, right? So either you've hired the wrong person, right, or kind of you don't need to manage the performance of that individual, right? Um, so fundamentally, I have always realized that the core of culture, as we call it in different organizations, right? It all boils down to rewards and recognitions, right? Which is kind of part of your performance evaluations and all of that. And the other big problem there in performance management systems is that we say it is at an individual level, but it is never at an individual level. It is always looked at as a group, right? And that's where bell curves and this, lowest performers, highest performers, and this and that. That means basically you're not looking at it at an individual level anymore. You're looking at it comparing one person to another person and things like that, which again defeats the entire thing, right? Defeats the entire purpose of building it out, which goes against the thesis that each individual has its own strengths as well, right? So the way, obviously at Flipkart and other companies, there are pretty clear processes in place, right? And you cannot deviate from the processes there much, right? So obviously I had to abide by those processes there. But an interesting thing that we did with the APM program, right, at Flipkart was that, and this was initially an experiment that I'd run, and I got the approval from HR and all of that. I said, like, hey, like, look, this is a 2-year program, right? I don't want these people to get kind of stunted right upfront in their career, thinking about the fact that I need to get to the best rating. I don't want that mindset, right? I don't want people to focus on their ratings. I would much rather have them focus on how can they skill up, right? So for the first 2 years, right, which is the AVM program duration at Flipkart, they did not receive any ratings. They received complete qualitative feedback from their managers and their mentors on what can they improve. So their focus was solely on what they are doing well and what they could do better. We took ratings out of the equation altogether. Okay. And till the time I was there, right, 100%, and I kid you not, 100% of the people, and there were close to about 70 or 80 APMs who had joined during my stint at Flipkart there. 100% of them graduated with their manager saying this person is already performing at the next level, right? And I attribute part of that performance to the fact that they did not have to worry about their ratings at all, right? So taking a cue from that, at NextLeap, we do not have a rating system at all, right? What we do is it's at an individualistic level. Okay, every 3 months, we will get into a conversation with the individual, right? Based on whenever they would have joined. So it is, in most organizations, you would see there's a performance appraisal cycle, like April, May, or end of the year, or whatever it is, right? And everyone will have to fill in, and it's a taxing exercise, to be very honest, right? Both for the managers and the employees as well. So here, that is not the case at NextLeap. It is like each individual will have a very different timeline for their performance depending on when they have joined, right? So for each person, it's either I'm looking at it from a 3-month period standpoint, and I'm looking at them from not in the form of ratings and things like that, but what are they doing well? What is it that they can do better, right? And that makes for a much better conversation with the individual. Now, I don't know if this is something which can be scaled up. So what I'm talking about is obviously with a smaller group of companies, as you scale up, complexities are very different, challenges are very different, right? So maybe something like this may not work out, but fundamentally, like, I've never been a fan of the performance management kind of system because I feel like you are putting the blame of wrong hiring on this, or you're having a system like that for this, or you do not trust the fact that everyone is putting in their best, right? So once you if you are trusting the fact that you are putting in your best, then why do you need to actually kind of do it? So at least that's my take on this. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think on that note, we have a question from Rishika on how do you sort of manage between the short term and the long term, the in process and the out process for employees. I think her question is, how do you strike the right balance between setting KPIs, such as, say, the number of sales that you have to close, or say if you work in an investment organization, which she does, the number of deals that you have to close, while also ensuring that people who are your high performers, because performance and certain aspects can be external, they can be cyclical in nature. How do you find the trust to help people also hold on to that confidence in, say, a cyclical period, right? So how do you balance that in process and out process, and while you remain very focused on targets and goals, you still keep the individual at the center of it and ensure that they're being able to perform on a continuous basis. They have a bad streak or they have a down cycle, it doesn't derail, right, the overall
Yeah.
pace they have in the organization. I think that'd be interesting
Yeah.
to understand how do you drive excellence without imposing rigidity as such.
Yeah. So again, the thing is, I think it has to be some kind of a middle ground of sorts, right? If you do a top-down thing, then many times you may not actually understand the ground realities well enough, right? And you might end up not hitting the targets, which might end up demotivating folks as well, right? Uh, on the other hand, if you just do it completely bottom up, right, then they may not have a sight of the bigger picture or what goals matter to the organization, etc. So they may not be aggressive enough, right, which the organization would want to have at a particular stage of growth. So I always feel like it has to be a bit of a middle ground of sorts. You kind of should always try to challenge the team members to ask them, okay, what is it that you would want to achieve, right? And let's try to put a stretch target to that, right? And then make sure that they're able to achieve it first, right? Because if, let's say, you put a stretch target, right? And like month over month, quarter over quarter, they're not able to meet it, they will automatically become demotivated, right? So the first thing is to get them a win. Okay, once they get a win, then they would be like, okay, I met it. Let me kind of try to stretch a bit more, and let me see if I can meet it, right? So, and that's the middle ground which I actually see, right? So first is, okay, maybe get it from the employee or the team member, something which they are completely comfortable with, right? And ride with it, because that's a very short term thing and you are playing for the long term. Get them a win, and then kind of ask them to stretch more, right? And move forward from there. Then automatically they will also realize that, okay, I need to actually do better on certain things and things like that, right? So again, goes back to that fog model, which I'm a very big fan of. Like, the behavior is a function of the motivation, the ability, and the triggers, right? So the motivation has to be in place. And what I've realized is, uh, in a team, if you are getting successes, the motivation automatically keeps building, right? If you are not getting successes, the motivation will keep dipping. It's as simple as that. Okay. So that's where the founders and the leaders will have to play a role to make sure that the motivation keeps building up. And then the ability is where you are training people, you are putting people at the right levels, putting people in the right roles, challenging them, and all of that. And the triggers is where kind of you are making sure there is some incentive aspect to it, right? Which they can all look up to and look towards and all of that, right? So yeah, so I think that's basically how at least I would approach it. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. And we have one last question from Hemant, who's asking, how do you strike a balance between healthy competition between team members, while still ensuring that collaboration and everyone focusing on the same goal remains at the forefront?
Um, so again, healthy competition, I think I would first question, okay, why do you want a healthy competition to begin with, right? Why do you want people to compete to begin with, right? Uh, in some functions it may work, but it may not work in a lot of functions, to be very honest, right? Why it may not work is because different functions operate in slightly different ways. For example, if you are getting a set of designers to compete, right, which is a very subjective area in a lot of senses, it may not work out, right? Because you do not have a clear guideline on what is good, what is not that great, right? But if you look at maybe from a sales standpoint, then maybe a bit of healthy competition might be good, because it's all about numbers. It's very clear objective, right? The processes are in place. Everyone's playing with the same tools and processes, right? It becomes easier there. So don't try to kind of blindly put in healthy competition, right? It may not work in a lot of different functions. Like operations, like especially factory operations, I don't think it works, right? Because people will start compromising on safety and things like that. And I've witnessed it firsthand, right? I had to actually kind of rebuke a few of my technicians, saying, Ki, this is actually quite dangerous, right? It's unsafe, right? You should not do it, right? And he was doing it just to get the award or the employee award and things like that, right? So you need to be very, very careful about driving that healthy competition, as we call it. But in functions where it is like any competition, the rules should be first of all very clear and transparent, right? If you're trying to drive that, and make sure that it is incentivizing the right behaviors. It should not actually bring in the wrong behaviors, and that's the thing with a lot of these healthy competition pieces. It can sometimes drive the wrong behaviors, which is never a good thing to actually have, right? So you need to make sure that your rules are very transparent. People understand that, understand the rules, understand the processes, etc., and it is not leading to the wrong behaviors, right? And which is what you need to outline upfront, and these are the guardrails, right? Otherwise, it will never work out. Okay. So yes, I think that's the thing, and the at the core of it, what fascinates me in all of this is that um, it's all about human behavior, and it comes down to human psychology. So if you understand human psychology a lot deeply, a lot better, then you will understand how to drive these aspects a lot better as well, right? So you have to be a student of human psychology, you have to be a student of human behavior, and how humans think, right? And the better you understand that, you will be able to figure out how to drive the best out of each of these different team members that you have. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. And just our last question before we wrap up. So, one of the things that high performance, in terms of like quote unquote how high performance organizations function, is it's almost a lot more of peer feedback than it is, say, top down feedback, right? If you're
Yeah.
doing something right or you're doing something wrong, in a high performance organization, you don't need your boss or your leadership to necessarily call you out. Ideally, the team that you work with will let you
Yeah.
know, right, where
Yeah.
you are doing well or you're potentially slipping up.
Yeah.
I want to get your thoughts on, whether this is something that you witnessed in your career, is something that's good. I know, for example, in PNG, we had this enormous culture of feedback, and it was like everybody
Yeah.
would give everybody feedback. It didn't matter what level
Yeah.
you were at, it was
Yeah.
expected, it was to be appreciated. But then at
Yeah.
some cases, it can also, I've also seen it, for example, piss people off. It's driven insecurity, driven wedges
Yeah.
between people, right? Any thoughts on this whole aspect of peer feedback, whether it's necessary, whether it's important, and is that really the
Yeah.
way the works should consider functioning?
Yeah. See, I think again, going back to human psychology again, right? People always, as humans, we always seek validation, number one, right? But at the same time, we also hold our actions at a certain level, and we don't like to be challenged. Most humans fall in that category. Okay. Um, the reason for that is because from a validation standpoint, you want that validation always to make sure that you are on the right track. And as humans, that's how we have been brought up, right? Like right from childhood, be that marks in school or medals or your parents actually giving you a candy for doing the right things or something like that, right? So we've always looked at some forms of validation, and that's now ingrained in us. So we are always looking for validation. Most of us look for validation. At the same time, we don't like to be challenged because we feel that I have acted in a way, in a certain situation, in a certain context, which this other person does not know, right? So I was right in acting in a certain way, right? And typically, most of us will not have that degree of self awareness to understand that there is also another perspective that comes in of how I acted or how I should have acted, right? So when it comes to feedback, right, typically what I've seen is a lot of people will ignore the positive side of things, right? And will always jump onto the negative side of things or over index on the negative side of things, because many times you will feel like I'm being challenged out here, that okay, you're giving me some feedback, right? Which is kind of you don't know the situation that I was in and things like that, right? So, and also the art of writing feedback is not kind of something which everyone masters. So if you look at it, and not just for human feedback, if you think about a simple thing of when do you write reviews for a product that you buy, you either write it, or most often you will write it when you have had a wonderful experience, you'll give a 5 star, or you'll give it a 1 star, right? There's nothing 3 star in between, right? So, and that's what usually happens in peer feedback also. The problem is that most people do not know how to give feedback, right? So either they will write all flowery stuff or non-actionable stuff, right? Or you will write something completely on the other end of the spectrum as everything's bad about this particular person, right? So the challenge with peer feedback is that, right? That most people do not know how to give feedback, right? But one of the things which I've learned the hard way also through a lot of coaching and all of that is whenever I have to give a negative feedback or an area of development, before writing that, I have to write one positive feedback. So it should always be balanced. If I'm writing 3 pieces of negative feedback, I should also write 3 pieces of positive feedback, right? And if you are doing that very simple thing, you automatically start getting a lot more balanced so that the individual does not feel challenged, right? And many times that's a good trick there, right? But again, you have to teach people how to write feedback there, right? Like I've seen so many people writing feedback, right? And it is just a one-liner, oh, he's great or he's awesome, this, that, like non-actionable stuff, which does, and that's why many times we ignore that, right? We always look at, okay, and even in performance appraisal discussions, the first thing which a lot of people would come and ask me is like, tell me what can I do better. I like first try to understand what you're doing well, right? So that you continue doing that, right? Don't lose sight of that because there are certain things which you're doing well. Just focusing on things which you can do better will not help you. So first register the things that you're doing well as well, right? So that's a very important thing, right? Which we need to keep in mind as we are trying to kind of drive human behaviors in our teams as well. Peer feedback is a very strong kind of a signal, uh, assuming that peers know how to write feedback, right? But many a times I've seen, especially in the Indian market, right? In the developed markets, it's very different, very different. Where in the US, etc., like people would actually give you very actionable feedback, right? Very articulate, right? They would take their time and kind of make sure that you understand or you can take away certain things from that feedback. But in India, unfortunately, at least the experience that I have had is that the art of writing feedback is not quite present in most people. So that's something which you need to address first before you go on to kind of writing on peer feedback.
Thank you so much for this, Arindam, and overall thank you for taking out the time. I know I said we'd spent an hour, but we've almost spent an hour and a half, and honestly we could spend another hour and a half just talking to you about leadership and teams. I mean, your diverse experience in India, abroad, across companies at all different scales and stages. It's been an eye opener in terms of how you look at some of these things which people often take for granted, and to get your very unique perspective on building teams, hiring people, managing people, and just allowing them to thrive and to do their best. Also, to everyone who took the time to join this call, thank you so much for spending the time on a Sunday morning to spend the time with us and attend this session. And with that, I guess we will just be wrapping up. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.